Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Many people, when they see the exhibit and they see the paintings of the saints, really would not be able to understand them or the symbolism that's painted in without knowing something of some story, the background stories. And that's one of the wonderful wealths, I suppose, of the Catholic heritage, is to keep alive a lot of the stories of the saints. And perhaps when Protestants go in there, they see part of a world that really was sort of taken away or put out of their own religious understanding over 400 years ago.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Roland Calvert, Associate Pastor at Pius X Parish in Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of El Greco and the lives of the saints. Here's Father Bacik.
Roland, I always enjoy it when we're in a group discussing together and you state some of your opinions and views. I find that people often listen carefully to when you speak, and that's a great tribute to someone. I think you often have really good insights, and I find myself being among those who pay special attention when you're talking. And so I'm glad that you've taken time out from a busy schedule to speak with me on the program and to talk a little bit about El Greco and the exhibit here in the city of Toledo.
Good. Thank you, Jim. It's an honor to be here. And to talk about this exhibition is rewarding. I think after you go to something like this, you're overwhelmed by the emotional and the sensual parts of it. You really need to sit down later and reflect and be quiet and talk as we are to try to understand what it is you've seen.
It strikes me that we often don't do that with things. Yes. I know I was watching King Lear on television recently, and the great performance of that, and one would need to assimilate it. It's so powerful that it would be important to be able to sit down and think about it, or even better to have someone to talk to us about it. I know I was talking to someone beforehand who knows things about Shakespeare, and they were telling me some things to look for, and I found that very helpful. But even simple things, I think, like watching movies or television, that sometimes would be good for parents to talk to their children about that, or just to be able, after a movie, to spend a little bit of time thinking, what did we get out of it, and so on. Because isn't that the truth about life? It's so fast, fleeting, it's dense, you don't get a hold of it. The mind can't assimilate that. I think sometimes I see movies like that, and I think, geez, I'd have to see that twice before I could ever figure out what it was about or get a hold of all the symbolism in it and so on.
Well, I think anything that's worthwhile. King Lear, for example, I saw the performance that you mentioned too, and I still have not done it justice, I don't think, but I've seen King Lear live probably 5 or 6 times by now, and the movie version of it, and read it and taught it in class. And the more you come back to it, the more you begin to realize the richness and the complexity and the wonder of that creation. Some people have the attitude almost like fast food restaurants. You do something and you do it quickly and you get over it. I remember a seminarian in Washington told me once he didn't like art very much, and he went down to the National Gallery of Art, which I had gone to hundreds of times, really. I lived there for 9 years, and I probably know the National Gallery better than any other museum. Anyway, he told me that after one afternoon visit on a Sunday, he said, "I've done it. That's it for a lifetime." I couldn't believe the words.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think many of us in the United States have that feeling. People visit Europe and they do the Prado in 2 hours, or the Louvre, or whatever. I think it's that idea to get it done, or to have done it. And what we miss, I guess, so often in our culture is the ability to savor things. I wrote one time it would be good to go into a museum and just sit before one painting for an hour and try to get at its richness and so on, rather than breezing through the whole thing. That would be a good discipline for those of us who have trouble dealing with time and accomplishment in the whole success-oriented culture.
Well, I did that very thing recently. Last week I was in Chicago, and I knew I was going to be doing this program with you. So I went to the Chicago Art Institute, which has 5 wonderful El Grecos. And the best of them, though, is a huge painting called The Assumption, which is a companion piece, I believe, to the Trinity painting in the exhibition. And I did literally do that, sat there for an hour and simply looked at it and began to see things that I had not seen before because I rushed by. And also, talking about place, just situating yourself, and the people who came there and shared at it. And on one of the earlier programs, we talked about the universal appeal of El Greco. I find it amazing that millions of people now in Chicago, because it's been there many years, have looked at a painting, and I bet a small minority of them are Catholic and share that belief in the Assumption, and yet it reaches out and touches them somehow. It's a fascinating thing to watch.
This is the greatness of art, isn't it? We're talking Shakespeare and El Greco and the great works of art, is that they really are not exhausted, and they have a universal meaning. Sure. And it's interesting, you can come back to them at different stages of your life and get something different out of them, precisely because your own experience is now different. You bring a different perception to it, and you see things there that perhaps were not available to you before.
It's the same as reading Huckleberry Finn in the 7th grade or the 8th, as is often done, and returning to it in college, or as I did a couple of years ago, much, much older. And what I brought to it was much different, and I began to see that this children's story is one of the most profound pieces of literature ever written.
I remember reading it again just a couple years ago, too, and having a similar experience.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the El Greco exhibit and its power to evoke within us deep sentiments and to move us. I've gone through it twice now. Would like to go through it again, and it would be helpful if people could find time to go through it slowly or carefully, and to spend some time pondering one of the other works.
And to take
go ahead.
Take the audio tour, I recommend highly. I thought that was a wonderful aid.
Very well done.
Yeah,
remarkably well done. And you could do it very practically by standing in front of one painting, listening, and then moving on to the next station. It's very well done.
It is, yeah.
Well, I would like to speak a little bit about El Greco's portrayal of the saints.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what people who are not of Catholic background make of all of that. In a sense that we have to remember that El Greco inhabited a Catholic world, a world of Catholic counter-Reformation Spain, a very defensive world in many ways, and a polemical world in which there was great argumentation going on between Protestants and Catholics. And I think that all of this work with the saints can be fit into that framework. In other words, the Reformers wanted to really get back to a Christocentric approach to Christianity, where Jesus Christ was the center, the only mediator between God and man, and where they wanted that to influence the piety and liturgical practice of the Church. And we see in reaction to that really a great emphasis on the saints in Counter-Reformation Spain and portrayed in the works of El Greco. So that probably is one way of locating it. And perhaps when Protestants go in there, they see part of a world that really was sort of taken away or put out of their own religious understanding over 400 years ago. Maybe for some of them it's very hard to take, or they wonder what that's all about. Maybe for others they feel sort of a challenge to assimilate something that could possibly be positive there. Just as surely we in the Catholic world have learned so much from the Reformers and have in fact adapted in the Second Vatican Council many of the insights and things that Luther and Calvin stood for in the 16th century.
Sure. Well, there are some saints, it seems to me, who cut across those boundaries of sectarianism. St. Francis of Assisi seems to have a universal appeal. We just had concluded the 8th centenary of his birth, and several of those, there's an appeal which is universal, it seems, that the humanity of the man comes through. I think some of the others, though, much less so, and you're right, what people would think about some of the other saints. St. Joseph, for example, is an interesting one. There was no cult, really, before the Counter-Reformation period, and St. Francis de Sales, the patron of my own congregation, was very instrumental in developing that devotion to St. Joseph. I believe Teresa of Avila was also significant. And El Greco picked it up with some beautiful portraits of St. Joseph and helped the cult of devotion and so on along.
Wasn't that the recovery of the figure of Joseph in one of the paintings that's shown there in the exhibit?
I think so.
Where they did the retouching and
the Holy Family.
Yes, and found the figure of Joseph behind. Yeah, I think it was the Council of Trent that gave a lot of impetus to that interest in Saint Joseph. I'm not sure that this day and age, Roland, we should use that word cult. That has a specific meaning for you and me in the theological vocabulary. But I think that would not be a good way to speak about the cult of Saint Joseph.
This is true.
I think that a devotion to Saint Joseph grew up, an interest in him, and we find that portrayed then in El Greco's work. A good example of him picking up a counter-Reformation theme.
Sure.
How about getting back to St. Francis that you mentioned? That is interesting. I think you picked the one person, maybe, who does cut across denominational lines or who has an appeal. I remember one of my students years ago of certainly not of Catholic background, this I think was in the late 60s, writing his paper on St. Francis, patron of the counterculture.
Yes.
And there was books and magazines out along that line at the time that Francis was one who renounced any kind of wealth and power and position and lived close to nature in a simple way. And some of the counterculture people saw him as a folk hero, someone to look up to for guidance or inspiration in their whole effort to live against the dominant value system.
Well, I think often St. Francis has been portrayed in a very romanticized way. For example, in the Zeffirelli film, El Greco gives you
the film?
the Brother, Sun, Sister Moon.
Yes, I never saw that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful film. It's certainly, I think, a limited view of St. Francis. When you look at El Greco's paintings, you see a man contemplating a skull. You see some of the austerity of St. Francis's life, and I'm not sure that that's always emphasized as much. It's probably the romanticism more that appeals, and the nature, the ecological movement. That there are a lot of things where he seems to touch our own time very deeply.
Isn't it interesting in the one painting of St. Francis that he's sort of cradling the skull in his hands, dealing with it rather gingerly.
Yeah.
And yet I have the impression, at least, of a man who therefore has come to terms with death.
Yes.
Who, if it was time for the Grim Reaper to appear, was ready to go, was ready to meet his Lord. And yet, maybe I'm off on this, but I see a respect for death in that. The way he's handling the skull, which I take to be the symbol of death. There's a certain gingerly way in which he's touching. I don't know if you got that impression.
Oh, I think so. That the terms that he used often of brother and sister, and I'm sure he'd speak of brother death, and that it was a friend, not an enemy.
Yes, brother death. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So we got St. Francis, who might have a larger appeal
to
people. You know, Roland, one thing I was thinking is that many people, when they see the exhibit and they see the paintings of the saints, really would not be able to understand them or the symbolism that's painted in without knowing something of some stories, the background stories. And that's, of course, one of the wonderful wealths, I suppose, of the Catholic heritage is to keep alive a lot of the stories of the saints. Although we must recognize that some of the distortions picked out in the time of the Reformation were very real, and that there is one mediator between God and man, and that's Jesus Christ, and saints cannot replace Jesus as the mediator. However, the wonderful stories we have of the saints seem to keep alive their meaning and some attribute or some way in which they lived out the Christian life that has an appeal, often very earthy, very sentimental maybe, or emotional kind of appeal, suggesting how we might try to live out the Christian life. Maybe that's one way of seeing them, in other words. But one has to know something of those stories, I suppose.
Well, one of the most interesting paintings in the exhibit for me was of St. Louis, or St. Louis of France, the king. And I had gotten to know him many years ago when I entered the Oblates. As I said, the patron of my congregation is St. Francis de Sales, and he is a contemporary of El Greco, a counter-Reformation figure. And he brought out
When did he die?
He died in 1622, born
El Greco died in
1614. Yeah. So they lived.
St. Francis de Sales.
Yes, living in what would be modern-day France, or the Principality of Savoy at that time. And he wrote in 1608 a book which is still a bestseller of spirituality, The Introduction to the Devout Life. And we read that as part of our novitiate, and it was part of our training. And I have used it so often in homilies and other things, because I still find it to be remarkably insightful. You know, it's a modern kind of work. It's not dated. There may be some phrases and so on which are Baroque and so on, but the psychology of it still seems to me pretty wonderful. Anyway, when we read that in the novitiate, I got to know, because I looked it up just for this program, 17 different times in it, and it's a short book, he comes back to King St. Louis, and he was obviously one of the heroes of St. Francis de Sales. Then I go to the El Greco exhibition, and it's the first time I've seen the image in person of the painting of King St. Louis that is in the Louvre Museum. Wonderful portrait. I just copied down this short couple of lines from the introduction, which gives an idea of what you're saying about the stories and why he was so popular. This is St. Francis de Sales writing. St. Louis, a king who was admirable in both war and peace, and administered justice and managed his affairs with unrivaled care, heard 2 masses every day, said vespers and compline with his chaplain, made his meditation, visited hospitals, confessed and took the discipline every Friday, heard many sermons, and held many spiritual conferences. And with all this, he never let pass a single occasion of promoting the public good. It was an ideal of a Christian king and an administrator who in his personal life was true to what he publicly professed. So I think it's pretty easy to understand why he would have been a hero to El Greco and his time, as well as to...
Do you feel those qualities come out in the painting, then?
I do, yeah. It's a noble man. And another interesting thing is that the dress of St. Louis, who lived, I believe, in the 1200s, is contemporary. It's the dress that El Greco's contemporaries would have recognized as their own, and it brings...
Don't you think that makes an important message? Because he does that a lot with his paintings, that is, put the people into his own time. What I think it means is that the life of the saint from the past has meaning in the contemporary situation. There's a way to live it out in this culture here and now. That's part of what I think we would get out of it, and part of what we would like to do with the saints. The saints are all historically conditioned. They lived in a particular culture and a world far different from our own. And the question is, can we take the virtues that they portrayed, whether it's humility or courage or temperance or a prayerful spirit or whatever, and somehow make that real in our modern, rapidly changing world?
Well, I think of the quotation of Karl Barth, I believe it was, that the Christian preacher ought to go into the pulpit with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And that's true by extension of all Christians, that you have to learn how to take that ancient Word of God and make it contemporary and make it live right now.
Now, one of the things we're doing in theology today is reviving the interest in stories. We talk about it as narrative theology. And we're seeing more and more that using stories to teach lessons is a valuable way, because it touches the emotions as well as the head, because it brings in an imaginative element as well. And I think that this is very helpful in looking at these saints and keeping in mind these stories. And I wrote one place where that El Greco had given us sort of a visual lives of the saints, an artistic portrayal of the lives of the saints. I mean, you can see all the stories right there in his paintings. It's remarkable. Of course, you have to know, again, some of those stories.
Well, it might be worth mentioning, you brought up the Council of Trent before, that not only was the Vulgate put forth, but I think they gave the advice that ordinary laymen should not read Scripture. And so really the pedagogy that went on was through the artists and the homilies, of course, and things like that. So you really needed that kind of teaching.
You know, some of the stories would be familiar to people because they're biblical stories. So we see St. Peter in tears and holding the keys, or the keys at his waist sometimes, which would remind people, of course, of Peter's sin and that Peter's denial of the Lord, his penitence over that, and yet the fact that he is made the leader of the apostolic community. And so that story would be familiar to people, as would be Mary Magdalene's story, that Mary Magdalene is a sinner and is repentant and especially healed and graced by our Lord. And therefore, in the paintings of El Greco, we see her often portrayed. She's a familiar figure and a reminder of the power of God to forgive. And at times, at least, she has this very serene look on her face, as though she has indeed accepted this forgiveness of God and is living it out now.
Well, one of the paintings is from I guess it's pronounced Worcester, Massachusetts, the Art Museum. I didn't even know they had one. And this magnificent portrait of the penitent Mary Magdalene. It's one of the loveliest paintings in the exhibition.
Now, some of these other saint stories will be unfamiliar to people. I think the legend about John the Evangelist, in which the emperor was trying to kill him with the poisoned wine, and when he went to take the goblet and drink it, the wine turned into a serpent so that he couldn't drink this poison. And sure enough, there it is in El Greco's painting of John the Evangelist.
Sure.
Or we think of Saint Sebastian. You always see those paintings of him with the arrows in it. He's the one who refused to sacrifice the gods. He was in the army, the Roman army. He refused to sacrifice and therefore was shot full of arrows.
Sure.
So he's a popular figure in religious art, and there he is in the El Greco exhibit.
Sure.
Sometimes with more arrows in him than others in some of his paintings.
It's rather dramatic. Yeah, the Baroque art could get rather wild at times, like the Bernini statue of St. Teresa comes to mind, of the ecstasy. And then you read the actual autobiography of the woman and the down-to-earth, practical quality. You know that that's not St. Teresa.
Right. The language of this 16th century, 17th century Spain is very confusing. When you try to figure out what their real spiritual experience was, you have a great deal of difficulty because the flowery language very often throws you off, I think, as to what was really going on with them.
Well, I was talking to Father Jim Cryan, with whom I lived the other day, and he is very, very knowledgeable about Francis de Sales. And he was talking about the different stages of Francis de Sales' literary career, that he at one time was trying to be very Latinate and embroidered complex sentences which concealed emotion. You didn't say how you felt really. You circumlocutously got all around it and maybe made the point at the end of the sentence or paragraph, and eventually changed to a more direct and a more Baroque kind of speaking, where the emotion did come out. And then even within that, there are several different styles, which I didn't fully understand, but there's a definite style. Even in El Greco, by the way, you know, the very first painting he did in Spain for Philip II was Saint Maurice, or Maurice, however it's pronounced. And it was rejected by the king, and as a matter of fact, he lost the entire possibility of a court career because he decided to be fancy. And he didn't show St. Maurice being martyred. He showed Maurice and his companions deciding to be martyred. And it was a little fancier, and that was rejected by the King Philip. And one of the witnesses who was there said that he would have accepted the martyrdom, but this glorified the style over the actual subject matter, and he rejected the artist.
And therefore, El Greco had to leave Madrid and go to Toledo and found his other lesser patrons there.
Yes.
You know, one of the paintings of the saints I like a lot in the exhibit is that of John the Baptist. Where John the Baptist is this heroic figure. One is reminded of Michelangelo and the great heroic human form. And the landscape is very low, and he towers over it. And there at the side is the Lamb painted, the Lamb of God. John the Baptist was the one who says, "Here is the Lamb of God," and who pointed him out. And yet you see the importance of John the Baptist in the whole history of salvation, and see something of his ascetic quality and that whole desert experience that he did undergo. I find that to be a powerful portrayal of that.
Oh,
Again, that's a theme that people of all backgrounds would recognize from the biblical account itself.
One of my favorite paintings in the whole exhibition, I don't know if there's a single one, but there are 4 or 5 that stand out, but the double portrait of St. Andrew and St. Francis of Assisi, with the big cross in between, the St. Andrew's
cross.
obviously
we're not contemporary.
No, they reach across the centuries and touch each other, and it's interesting to put them together.
So we got St. Andrew, a biblical figure, and early centuries, and here we got St. Francis in the 12th century or so, and you know what's interesting about that painting too is the X-shaped cross that St. Andrew is holding. The legend is that that's how he died. Not to die on the same type of cross that Jesus died on, but this X-shaped cross, and there that is dividing the two figures, or is in between the two figures. Again, that little bit of information would help one understand.
Oh, it would.
The painting.
There's a line in T.S. Eliot's 4 Quartets, which we talked about earlier at one of your reflections discussions, and which I've been almost obsessed with. I just been returning to it. It's so beautiful. But it applies to what you're just saying. Eliot writes this: But to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardor, and selflessness and self-surrender. I love that comparing of eternity and time, and the intersection is what the saint is so deeply aware of that we who tend to get immersed in daily activities are not so aware of. And El Greco's art brings that out, the feeling of timelessness, that these are humans who see beyond the time-immersed activities they're in.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. It's a characteristic of all of those paintings of the saints that he has. You know, I guess we'd have to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of the saints for our own time? And I think that one of the emphasis points is on this idea of example, of people who were able to do, as you said, find the meeting of the divine and the human, and the infinite in the midst of the finite. They're people who portray in one way or another the virtues that we celebrate in the Christian life. You know, whether it is the asceticism of John the Baptist or the simplicity of St. Francis of Assisi, as we've been talking about it, or the importance of St. Joseph in the whole salvation history story of the coming of Jesus, or St. Dominic wrapped in prayer and so close to the Lord within. St. Sebastian, courageous to the point of he won't sacrifice, and he's even shot with the arrows and so on.
Yes.
So we can go down the line with all of these great saints. There's one we didn't mention, that St. Martin, one of the most famous paintings he did, a well-to-do military man who had a cloak and cut it in half to give to the beggar, so that we see in that painting a reminder of that story. But
then contemporary dress with the city in the background of Toledo.
Again, the idea, why couldn't we be charitable now?
Sure.
Roland, thank you so much. So much more we could say, but I guess this much, that the saints have great importance for El Greco and really could have for people of all different backgrounds today.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Roland Calvert, associate pastor of Pius X Parish in Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was El Greco and the Lives of the Saints. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.